That's why I'm glad you got topics today, because like I've been very, I didn't really have a lot to share this week, but
Yeah, you got a little mentally distracted, maybe.
yeah, I mean the whole coming out thing was, well, so the day I did it, I was I was watching that Steven Crowder live stream, all 3 hours and 45 minutes of it.
Ugh.
And yeah, this video will be up before that, but let me tell you, it was a shit show.
A reaction video to it?
Yeah, it was. I guess we would call it the first reaction video. Yeah.
I mean, maybe solo reaction video.
Solo
right?
react. I didn't want. Honestly, after watching it, you should be thanking me that I decided to take that upon my own volition.
Oh yeah, no, I mean Steven Crowder is a freaking
He's
not a man child, dude.
No, yeah. Actually, it was really funny. Maybe if we have time to share it. There's a video of him trying to talk to a black mural artist about the protests, and he gets utterly fucking owned by him.
Yeah, man. I mean, when you can't separate from daddy and you're still having that, you know. I mean, it's a rough day.
Right. Anyway, but if you don't find it, the Surfs did a reaction to it, and it's fucking hilarious. So.
And are you a Surfs Patreon, or are you just following them on YouTube?
You know, there's honestly a lot of people on LeftTube that I really should be supporting on Patreon, whether that be Ali or Contra or the Surfs or the Majority Report or Michael Brooks or the Antifada. I
don't watch Antifada. I should probably do that.
Really? Okay, so Jamie's very knowledgeable, and after watching a few streams, she's actually very insightful, and I would recommend the Antifada.
Well, I mean, that's kind of her, because the MBS, Sam Cedar, and...
Yeah. Okay, so if we're talking about, what is it? What, falling down, what we would call a left-wing rabbit hole, you would start with Majority Report, and then you would probably get into TMBS. If you wanted to be more radical communist, then you would do the Antifada, listening from a anarcho-communist perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the craziest thing, man, is people are like, oh, man, you're an anarchist, you're terrible. I'm like, dude, you keep using this word, and I don't think you know what it means.
I mean, I believe that there is a general misconception about anarchism.
Yeah.
Especially when you deal with those ANCAPs who clearly don't know about anarchy.
Have a very interesting way of kind of falling down the alt-right rabbit hole. And
yeah.
I feel like, unfortunately, it winds up turning them into some crazy radicalized, pseudo-Nazi that's pushing social Darwinism.
Well, okay, because there was a time when I myself had the label of anarcho-capitalist. This was years ago. This is probably a decade ago. And, it obviously didn't start that way. I started as just exploring libertarianism, the capital L libertarianism. And then that sort of progressed to calling myself a minarchist. And then ultimately trying to call myself an advocate for anarcho-capitalism. Yeah. This was back in the age of MySpace. This is where I cut my teeth politically. Joining those MySpace groups, political groups. So people on Facebook now, I feel like a lot of them are pretty noobish when it comes to this, talking politics on social media forums. But I remember joining the anarcho-capitalist group, the libertarian group, even stuff like MySpace left versus right. George W. What's up?
Did you read anything by like Max Stirner?
I have not actually, although I
So
have heard of Max Stirner.
Max Stirner is basically the anarcho-capitalist, like egoist argument for extreme individualism rather than a collective form of
Yeah.
anarchist. Because I
So
mean,
the anarcho-capitalist I read was Murray Rothbard.
mm,
That
mm,
was my guy that I referenced a lot. Besides Mises.
mm. Did you realize that your material interest no longer or like was it more of a like, oh Jesus Christ,
Well,
capitalism is innately incongruent with anarchism?
no, it wasn't that. It was basically like trying to, because my position was collectivism was anti-individualism and authoritarian.
Mm,
So my argument was based around that framework.
okay, okay.
So I'm not doubting that well, never mind, because I really believe that an anarcho-capitalist society probably could have been possible.
I
Never.
mean, I think it will always go towards like a neo-feudalist, like tyrant king.
Yeah, basically just private entities having their own militias, basically.
Yeah,
Private
I mean, if
armies.
you're cool with like if you're cool with like roving war bands and assassinations, like I mean, that's congruent. But I mean,
Yeah. It was an interesting time. But anyway.
yeah,
Um,
I'm pretty sure I read like the Communist Manifesto when I was like 16, and then
really? That young, huh?
yeah, and then
I was a lot older.
went to anarchism and like along with like Noam Chomsky probably around like 19, I would say.
I had no you should have told me these things because at that time I was like a hardcore libertarian back then. So I feel like we would have had some interesting discussions.
Yeah, yeah. I mean the like I the only the as I branched out, I mean, I would say probably now I've probably come into the biggest realization where I have like difficulty reconciling the need for the state and trying to, do like a preservation of your society. Um, Simply because if we look at like anarchistic states, while they have existed and have been successful, they are also almost continuously invaded by capitalist and fascist frameworks.
Oh well,
Like,
I mean, we can talk about during the Russian Civil War, anarchists in the South Ukraine, the the black anarchists at the time,
yeah,
sided with the Bolsheviks against the White Army, and were ultimately betrayed by the Bolsheviks and taken over. And then we can talk about Catalan society during the Spanish Civil War. Same thing, you know.
or one.
Yeah.
Uh,
Or we can talk about oh shit, what is anarchist collectives being established in Central America?
oh, the Zapatistas.
Yeah, Zapatistas.
Yeah, and I
Uh,
mean, like,
I would say they probably were the most successful.
they're
Yeah, I
still
mean, I
being.
was gonna say they're what I mean most successful as in they're still existing.
Yeah, I mean, and you're so is Rojava, right? I mean,
hmm
they're just jeopardized by Turkey, and Turkey has invaded part of northeastern Syria.
Well,
Once
or are we gonna say Rojava is anarchist or just mainly just socialist?
it's I would say it's like
I
a
mean,
kind
it's
of
an autonomous Kurdish area. Yes.
yeah, it's an autonomous Kurdish area with a semi-direct democracy looking and representation
Yeah.
along with it's I would say it's more of like a libertarian socialist, not entirely anarchist, right?
Yeah.
Like, but definitely a libertarian socialist viewpoint.
I mean, that's interesting. Like, okay, so we talk about anarchism and libertarian socialism. Like, what do you think is like The mere distinction that separates the two.
The relative existence of a state.
Okay, well, I feel like anarchism, in terms of the more traditional sense, so sorry for any anarcho-capitalists out there, you don't belong in this discussion, but I'd say libertarian socialism is more broadly defined as opposed to anarchism. That's just me, though.
I mean, that's like saying like Catalonia was an anarcho-syndicalist state because, you know, they still organize within the syndicates or unions.
Yeah.
It's similar to like a council communist point of view.
Right. Yeah.
It's all on what people want to identify with.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. It's like talking about how leftists describe each other, and like how much nuance is there in terms of, you know, how we differentiate ourselves, essentially.
Yeah.
Because go on.
There's relatively high agreement among like libertarian socialists, right? Like, I mean, if you look at relative agreement on just the material interests are almost always going to be the same. I personally like the syndicalist approach or the council approach.
Yeah.
Simply because the material interests of one group are not going, even if you have just like the working class aligned, the material interests are not always going to be the same based on geopolitical factors, resource management, and you know, like different traditional elements within their society and culture.
Right. You know, I would say in terms of all this terminology, I feel like, you know, you can use multiple terms. I mean, I would describe myself as libertarian socialist, market socialist, but I'm also a member of the DSA. So, you know, take that for what it's worth. I just, it's not, I guess the point I want to make is on the left, it does seem to be a bit tribalistic, and people are very contentious about their labels and how they view other people. And I could say that, like, I'm somewhat of a victim to that, because I don't really have a very high regard view of what I would call tankies. But
dude, Tanky's gonna tank, okay?
That's why I always say Tanky's gonna tank. Well, it's really interesting because, like, there are some left groups that I follow on Facebook, and I kind of realize they do like the hook, line, and sinker. Like, I'll follow them because like there's a meme that they share, and so I'm following the group, and I see more of their posts. I'm like, oh, okay, I like that, and then I see like a Tanky post. I'm like, wait a minute,
hold up there, hombre.
Yeah,
and the unfortunate thing is Tanky's, you know, it's imperialist propaganda. You know, Stalin did nothing wrong. I'm like, oh, dude.
Did you watch? So there was a recent debate I watched. I wouldn't necessarily say recent, but a little while back. I'd say a few weeks ago, where Vosh debated. God, I forget his name, but he's a Tanky. And they use that Western imperialist propaganda is used quite frequently.
Yeah, I mean that's just like you create a straw man out of that, you steel man your own position, and it's not a because I mean, like, you can look at like the often cited thing like within the Black Book of Communism, which is absolute trash, by the way.
Yeah.
Even the co-authors have distanced themselves from that and say that their research was misrepresented. But 100 million people did not die underneath socialist regimes.
Okay. That whole deal, like, if we want to do a pissing match with numbers, if anybody that decides to bring up deaths under communist regimes, I feel needs to have the intellectual fortitude and honesty to try and defend the deaths of people that have suffered under capitalist systems.
Yeah, they immediately put that straw man up there that 100 million people have died, which is debunked thoroughly.
Yeah.
People died in terrible fashion through incompetence and not diversifying their resource management. And I think like the primary mechanism at which people are proclaiming that people died from was famine and starvation. And I'm going to say with like Amartya Sen in The Development is Freedom, democracy is the only way to prevent famine. And that's true within capitalist states and within socialist states. And both have instigated famines.
I was going to say, I mean, people like to talk about the Great Leap Forward and the Holodomor in the Ukraine and then China, respectively, as examples of how mismanagement can lead to famine on the communist side. What is often failed to be talked about is the Irish potato famine and the famine in I believe the 1942 famine in India.
The Bengal famine. Oh,
yes, yeah. Both of which were results of a capitalist system, especially the Irish potato famine. If you read the Irish potato famine, you read how Great Britain decided to continually export outside from the grain being made in Ireland, despite the fact people were starving.
Oh, yeah, they didn't give a shit.
Yeah. Just because of profit incentive.
Yeah. Well, we also have to think about most people would agree that the dominant economic system around the world is capitalism, right? Specifically neoliberal capitalism.
Yeah.
And if we also look at what country has done the most to reduce overall absolute poverty, right? And they change that number depending on what they want to do.
Yeah.
China has done the most out of any country in the last 100 years. So to say that that's there, right, or that it's capitalism has improved everyone's lives, I'm a little iffy on that. And then we also have to think about all the mass starvation deaths that are happening in the global south, which have continuously been extorted of their resources through neo-colonialism. Like what is going on with that?
Well, so I don't want, this isn't China, but there's something I want to bring up is Vietnam and how they are handling the COVID crisis. So they have people literally, they have stay-at-home orders, but they're having people literally delivering goods to families at home, which is astonishing. Like, you can talk about, you can critique Vietnamese communism as much as you want. In terms of like how they provide for people, I feel like that is a remarkable feat.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing that people will cite is like Venezuela, for instance, right? Yeah. And they also will be, that's socialism. Yes, sort of. Yeah. But we also have to think about how much private ownership is still running the economy. France has more public ownership of their GDP, and Norway and the Scandinavian countries far exceed that.
I mean, so go on.
Owns of the means of production. If that's our definition of socialism, then that's a different animal, right? If you're talking about a welfare state, Adam Smith advocated for a welfare state. Aristotle advocated for a welfare state. Yeah. That is not exclusive to socialism.
Well, it's like, I mean, socialism is pretty broadly defined. Like, you can talk about instances like Vietnam. You can talk about the model of Venezuela, or Brazil, where, you have them attempting to reform change in democratic means. Or you can talk about, situations that happen in Europe, like in the Scandinavian countries. Or in Germany, for example, where the majority of all corporations, the workers have the majority of shares within the company.
Yeah. I'm pro worker co-op. I mean, the other thing that we have to consider is when we're looking at, oh my God, socialism's death toll, people are starving in Venezuela. Tell me how the trade embargo has gone with that within the United States.
Well, I mean, that goes to the larger contextual argument. Like, people want to argue the failures of socialist countries. I'm like, can you honestly... And this is just, I mean, an honest discussion. We can talk about the shortcomings of where socialist countries has failed. I acknowledge that as much as I acknowledge the failures of capitalism. But it's an honest question to ask. Like, can you name me a socialist country that tried to be socialist that wasn't also strangled internationally or was tried to be overthrown by the CIA?
Yeah.
Like, there's, okay, so I'm starting on working like on my first private, like my first individual like documentary video, and it's going to be about the Indonesian military coup in 1965. Because back then Indonesia had outside of China and the Soviet Union, had the largest communist party that was democratically elected. The people spoke, and yes, the communists were the most organized at the time. I mean, at the time, Indonesia just gained independence from the Dutch. And in 1965, the CIA orchestrated a coup with the Indonesian military. They took over, and what resulted was a mass genocide of approximately 1 million people. And the code name was Jakarta. And it served as a staple for other CIA-backed coups. Like for instance, in Chile.
Yeah.
When Salvador Allende was taken over by Pinochet,
push through the neoliberal reforms.
The pro Pinochet people actually, used the code word Jakarta, spray painted on places and uttered the phrase as a means, as a message saying, we're coming to kill you. So the Jakarta method served as a staple for basically the U.S. way of intervening in toppling socialist governments throughout the world, whether that be in Asia or definitely more prevalent in Central and South America. Whether you talk about Chile, you talk about Guatemala,
Iran,
or you talk about, even in Cuba. So Che Guevara was present in Guatemala at the time at the CIA, when the CIA backed a coup that toppled the socialist government. And again, another country where when the CIA toppled the socialist government, a genocide ensued. So he was there when that happened. So of course that's going to resonate with future socialist endeavors, because when Batista is overthrown in Cuba, what happens? You have the baked pigs. But of course it fails. But it shows that the U.S. was willing to even topple socialist governments in there.
Oh, yeah.
So you see how, in many ways, armed opposition by leftists was justified in a sense. And that took a dangerous turn. Because if you look in the past, if you going back to, I'm all over the place in terms of history and geography, but if you go back to Indonesia, the Communist Party was democratically elected. If you go in places like Italy, the Communist Party tried to make an attempt in the 1940s after World War II to get elected. The CIA intervened. In Indonesia, they intervened. So leftists are looking at this and they're realizing, okay, well, if we can't achieve socialism through democratic means, I guess we're going to have to do this for force. So people that were looking at this were people like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. And the more extreme extent was Pol Pot. They looked at this and they saw that we can't trust that we're going to be treated the same way as capitalist countries. We have to view every international overture as a threat. So what did Pol Pot do? He formed the Khmer Rouge and they took power in their own way. And now I'm not defending the Khmer Rouge, but what you see in terms of U.S. back topplings of socialist governments, it led to a general distrust of socialists trying to achieve their means through democratic means.
Well, you also have seen, I would have to imagine that you've seen some evidence to support the United States supporting the Khmer Rouge, right?
That was after that's the bitter irony of it all,
Yeah,
because
Vietnam.
that's geopolitics of, because after the Cameroons took over and they fucked up, the Vietnamese intervened and invaded,
Yeah,
and as a result, the United States decided to back the Khmer Rouge government in exile, which was backed by China, which the United States recently opened diplomatic relations with again under Nixon,
yep,
versus the Vietnamese, which were backed by the Soviet Union. So
yeah,
it's very weird, because yes, during the Vietnam War, the USA, the CIA intervened and toppled the government in Cambodia and installed a military dictatorship, which was overthrown by the Khmer Rouge in 1975. And then the USA goes to supporting the Khmer Rouge because they don't like the Vietnamese.
yeah. After bombing them with Agent Orange and doing a ton of war
Well, I
crimes.
mean, the Khmer Rouge themselves, like, this is the thing, because the United States, our country, is very notorious for creating our worst enemies, because the Khmer Rouge came to power as a result of the secret bombing of Cambodia in 1969, 1970, as well as the invasion of Cambodia in the subsequent years of 71, 72.
It's easier to control a dictator than it is a democratically elected populace.
Oh, yeah, because what was the CIA mantra? I don't care if he's a son of a bitch, as long as he's our son of a bitch. I mean, you can look at that most prevalent in Central and South America. Just, yeah.
True.
I mean, we're looking at it right now. We can look at it right now in a more minor sense with Bolsonaro. And how the Brazilian court under Lava Jato basically made up trumped up charges against Lula to put him in jail, so he could not compete against him in the elections.
Well, I mean, that, or the amount of cocaine that Bolsonaro was caught moving around, the relative starvation and oppression of people in the favelas. Like, there's,
I mean, this is a guy that praises the military junta of Brazil of that time period.
Oh yeah, no, he's extreme. I mean,
he is basically the Augusto Pinochet of Brazil.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like Brazil has a good relationship with, or a good history with the amount of right-wing dictators that have swung through there.
And I want people to, like, if they're watching this, to clarify, to please look up Lula da Silva's accomplishments as president of Brazil. 4th largest country in the world. One of the strongest economies in South America. You look at what he did and what he was able to do in terms of achieving socialism, and it's astonishing. And that's why he's still so popular. Yeah.
But so, I mean, that's the biggest thing, is I feel like when you look at it historically, democracy, and more specifically, like a libertarian or even just any socialist state that has a democratic framework, 9 times out of 10 is opposed by a authoritarian dictatorship, and many times there's, like, you can call them fascist elements if we're using Umberto Eco's definition of that, or you can just say right-wing authoritarians. I mean, that's
I would say Bolsonaro definitely fits fascism in the vanilla sense.
Yeah, most definitely.
So, what is it I said? Like, Brazil has a fascist president, just not yet a fascist government. I mean, the same could be said in America. Like, Trump styles himself as sort of like a neo-fascist president, but because I feel like he's frustrated because he has to deal with checks and balances within the U.S. system. So we don't necessarily have a fascist government per se.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet.
Not yet. I mean, you do have McConnell that's basically serving as the backup, and we're looking at a massive flip within the federal courts.
Right.
But there is still enough of a remnant, and the checks and balances have been
Well, that's why Mitch McConnell's called the gravedigger of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, he's a terrible man. If you look at some of the statements that he just said, like, we paid for the sin of slavery by electing Barack Obama.
That was absolutely fucking ridiculous of a comment to make. Absolutely.
Yeah, or you have Tom Cotton that's advocating for a return to chattel slavery, and then you have Donald Trump stating, "I've done more for minorities than Abraham Lincoln has done." And Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and we see how that turned out. Like, what are you saying?
Well, so getting back to Mitch McConnell, and I want to look at him through the dichotomy of Bush and Cheney. Like, Bush was the figurehead, he was the idiot, but Cheney was definitely more of the man behind the scenes that got stuff done.
Oh, there's a reason they call it the Cheney era.
Yeah, in terms of a neoconservative agenda. Mm-hmm. Mitch, in my sense, in this time, fits the Cheney model. Trump's a blustering idiot. He says these things, and it distracts people from like what's actually being done right now in the system of government under Mitch McConnell's control of the Senate, particularly through his approval of Supreme Court and district judges.
Oh, and the blocking of
and the blocking, like when the Democrats swept the House in 2018, McConnell now framed himself as holding up the keep, which is the Senate, in terms of blocking any type of progressive reform. That's basically his mantra now. Is like, I'm going to make sure that nothing passed in the House gets approved in the Senate.
Yeah,
absolutely.
To also remind people, I mean, I think we also need to look at the fact that at the initiation of the country, the Senate was never elected.
No, that's true. I mean, what the Senate was, I'm trying to remember. I believe that they were selected by the states just to represent them. Yeah, they weren't directly elected, was what I'm saying.
Yeah. And they also had a majority of the power, and the Senate with James Madison has always been there to represent the material interests of the upper class, and more specifically, the white landowning upper class. And
well, America's foundation was entirely based on that premise, the advocation of the upper class white people, because at the time, the only people that were allowed to vote were white people that owned property.
White men.
Yeah, sorry, white men. Sorry. Yeah, I'm being too liberal when I talk about people because, women were allowed to vote. All minorities were not allowed to vote. So,
yeah. I mean, when you're looking at focused genocide of one minority group and then a complete enslavement of another, I mean, it's like all men are created equal. And when I mean men, I don't mean these people.
Okay, all right. So you're talking about genocide of Native American people. Can you explain to me why you would describe that as genocide?
Oh, very simple. So the United States government would actively pay you for scalps, right? They would actively pay you money for Native American scalps. And I don't know how many people are going to be able to sit there and live through a scalping, right? Yeah. It's not exactly a gentle thing. Mm-hmm. We're also looking at a systematic destruction of their culture, as well as a removal of their resources, including water, land, and their traditional way of life, which is how they were able to produce their society for themselves and prosperity. So if we're also looking at the focused ghettoization, right? Uh-huh. I mean, the Nazis actually based a lot of their policies on American strategies. And Hitler was envious of the way that the Americans treated the Redskins. So, I mean, it's the same thing with how the Americans' eugenics program was there, right? With social Darwinist elements. We're looking at a mass amount of people that once upon a time occupied the entire continent, and now they're relegated to either being part of the mestizo population within Mexico,
Yeah.
right? That have come up through here, and there's a lot of genetic diversity that comes through that. We can also see the utter enforced poverty that comes through, along with the continued oppression within the Native American elements. And if you want to see a developing area or a third world nation or abject poverty within the United States, look no further. Go to your closest reservation. The chance of outside of there being a casino, the amount of revenue generation is limited. Sure, they're autonomous zones, but we also have to think about the forced relocation of people, right? Along with a outlawing of their native languages and like tribal practices. It's basically assimilate or die.
Right. I mean, I was only asking because I just wanted to hear your view. I'm not necessarily disagreeing, but I see there seems to be a viewpoint in America that in terms, we tend to shy away from using genocide in our history. There was a time where I was like, oh yeah, totally ethnic cleansing, of course. But when you talk about the Indian Removal Act is the prime example of that. The Indian Wars in the late 19th century is another example. But yeah, I think you hit upon some points. The forced integration of Native Americans into white culture. Sterilization, the eugenics program is another one. Yeah, no, I just... Like, I know people, because here's the problem. Genocide is a very 20th century term, so it's very hard to apply it within a context that happened in centuries prior to that. If you catch my drift.
I do. Yeah. It's like you're looking at a...
Because when most people think genocide, they obviously think of Nazi Germany. The Armenian genocide is what we technically consider the first genocide in the 20th century, so that's what the word genocide was based off of. You have genocide through mismanagement, like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia.
I would say there was a little bit more than mismanagement on part of the Khmer Rouge.
Well, of course. I just want to, yes, we can get into that. We can get into the failures of the Khmer Rouge, but I'm just saying, like, basically how they managed the country resulted in a famine that killed millions. And I'm not saying that they died through starvation. A lot of the people at the Khmer Rouge were just abruptly killed by the Khmer Rouge because they wore glasses or they were a little too Western for their fucking patience. So I'm just saying, like, because genocide is a term that basically describes crimes against humanity in the 20th century. It's very, some people have trouble, especially in America, and I'm not just arguing because of American exceptionalism. It's very hard for them to square away that term with the practices that the country did in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah.
Even what you left out, which is fine, because there's a lot, you can only keep track of so many atrocities. You left out how Native people were forcibly adopted by white parents. This was not even true. This was not also true in America. It was also very true in Canada, and especially true in Australia with the Aborigines.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's basically just like a absolute...
That is definite use of cultural genocide.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to utterly remove that people's way of life and try to, like I said, right, assimilate or die.
Yeah. Well, it's very funny because American history is basically like white people wanting to integrate Native Americans who did not want to be part of American culture, like American culture in quotations. Meanwhile, ignoring African Americans who wanted to be in every aspect a part of American culture and absolutely refused them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, are you also familiar with like the American through internal estimates, right? So this is declassified information from the Korean War. estimated that 20% of the population was killed during the U.S. bombings, and
Oh, I
continued
don't
to,
deny that. What was I think more bombs were dropped into Korea than in Europe during World War II.
yeah.
So no, I don't deny that. I don't deny that at all. People talk. I mean, American deaths from the Korean War was about like a little over 50,000.
Yeah.
Give or take. I could be wrong on that. Don't quote on me. But the deaths by Koreans was astronomical. I mean, deaths by all these proxy wars were astronomical for the native country. I mean, we can talk about Vietnam too, about how many deaths were sustained in that 10-year conflict. Let alone the neighboring countries like Laos and Cambodia also.
Yeah, that's bad. And I mean, like the other thing is like if the argument is if you're going for mercantile capitalism or industrial capitalism. 1 second, I gotta go check out my kid.
Yeah, go ahead. It's fine. Take a break. I'm gonna go to the bathroom.
So we were talking about the death tolls associated with capitalism and either being associated, because a lot of times people will say that there's no transitionary stage between feudalism and capitalism, that it was just one revolution.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, some people will say, oh, it's Oliver Cromwell. Some people will say it's the starting foundation of joint stock companies within Amsterdam or within other frameworks to distribute risk. I am personally a fan of the mercantilist approach because, I mean, we have to think about the true enclosure of the commons when we started to see a large shift in urbanization and a seizure of the means of production and removing people's way of life where before they were sustenance farming.
I would say the transition took hundreds of years. I would say my earliest start would probably go to the Black Death, because I feel like the Black Death was the first sort of like kink in the feudal system, because yes, it killed a lot of people, especially peasants. So the peasants that were left realized, and this is what I guess we would first describe as class consciousness. The peasants realized, I don't have to stay here and work these fields. I can go to a different lord for a better pay and work their lands. So you have this social mobility movement of the peasant class actually demanding better treatment from their lords.
Well, yeah, you also had like the diggers within medieval England, which were they did not. It was very. It reminds me a lot of like Martin Luther being like, okay, you know, it's personal prayer. Basically, right. A bunch of peasants saying, you know, the king is not the divine word of God. Like we should be able to look on this on our own.
Yeah.
And going against the monarchy, especially, and that has a long history. I think. You know, it all depends on what you want to go with it. And people say, oh, feudalism and capitalism are not congruent. And I would say, okay, then why do we have kings and queens and lords and ladies?
Right.
I mean, if it's not there, then it's a really shitty argument. It's a really shitty argument, which just doesn't line up with the facts at all.
No, I agree. Yeah.
But okay, so we kind of went off on a.
No, it's fine. We were talking about. You wanted to talk about Tulsa.
I did. So I wanted to talk about Tulsa.
Okay, go ahead. Talk about Tulsa.
So reason why I wanted to talk about Tulsa is the first bit, which was recently pushed through by Trump trying to do a rally at June 19th in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And, you know, I see Republicans saying, oh, it's because of a respect for June 19th that they're not doing that. And I would immediately say that Trump does not respect anything but power and money.
I just want to clarify, as we're recording this, Trump has yet to do his speech at Tulsa. Now his speech is being written by Stephen Miller, a man who wouldn't necessarily say is the most prominent advocate for minority rights, but we have yet to know the context of what he's going to talk about. So, I mean, yes, it does seem like it's adding insult to injury when you have these protests and uprisings happening across the country against police brutality, especially against minority groups. And he is going to talk at a city that had one of the worst massacres of minority groups in the 20th century, on top of the day that emancipation happened after the Civil War. So I'm really interested in how he's going to try and contextualize this in a very positive message that's going to resonate with minority groups in this country.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think people too need to realize some of the things that come along with Juneteenth as well. But I think one of the big problems that they're just not recognizing is the fact that Juneteenth, while the Emancipation Proclamation was there and the Civil War had already ended, it wasn't until June 19th of 1965.
Yes.
Several years after the last defeat of Robert E. Lee, right?
At Galveston, Texas, this was the official commemoration of ending slavery in the United States. Yes.
Now, what is the question, right? Because we see that slave owners pushed a lot of their slaves during the Civil War into Texas because they thought that they'd be able to reclaim their property during that time.
Yes, that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up because that is not known by a lot of people with U.S. history, was that Texas was used as sort of a warehouse to store slaves.
Yeah.
Because at the time, you had Grant ravaging Virginia and you had Sherman going straight through the heart of the Confederacy, like through Alabama and South Carolina, destroying plantations in southern cities.
It is... Let's just say that when people are using the phrase human stock capital or human capital.
Yes, that has such a slave connotation to it.
Oh my God. And I don't understand why it's an acceptable. I mean,
it's not an acceptable term. And the fact that the Labor Department currently is using that is absolutely apprehensible.
Yeah, it's plain disgusting.
Yeah.
But I wanna share this video because I think it concisely summarizes why it was in such poor taste. Mm-hmm. So let's take a peek here.
Okay, all right.
So everyone see this video?
Yeah, I see it. We're good.
Okay.
Full screen it.
Civil unrest like this there.
Can you hear that?
I hear it. Full screen it.
Perfect.
All right, cool.
Three types of people in the street. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices and they're there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists, who really just want to fuck shit up, and that's what they're going to do regardless. And then you have the looters. And the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. Now, people are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why. And that's my issue with that. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, well, those are people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor Blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is they're going to get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot, that they are shooting their shot window to get what they need. And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pull themselves up out of bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that Black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money. I didn't allow you to have anything on the board. I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then,
can you pause it for a second? The fact that she's using Monopoly, I feel like encapsulates the perfect example of capitalism. Especially at the end when you get frustrated and you flip the board over and go, revolution! Fuck this!
Yes. I mean, the other component is like, I'll have to show like the Washington Post article about millennials being the unluckiest generation in American history, right? Or that generational mobility is that of the Victorian England.
Yes.
And it takes on average 5 generations to elevate yourself.
Extreme nepotism. Yes.
Yeah. There's also psychological research going with Monopoly where it's like, when you see this, right, if people start with an unfair advantage, they understand that at the beginning. Right. As they play, they're like, oh man, I just played smart. You have an opportunity to catch up. Right. As they own it.
it's like just like people defending the capitalist system, like, well, I was successful. I made it. I got through the system okay. When it's like the same thing can be argued like, well, I won the lottery. That means anyone can win the lottery, when it's actually a very small proportion.
Yeah.
So
it's fair.
Yeah, I like how people try to contextualize that as somehow being fair, but okay, we can continue.
Yeah. Let's continue with this though, because then she freaking rips into it.
Okay.
Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa. That was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient.
Pause it again. I'm really sorry, because like in terms of Tulsa, this is fucking true, because the reason why the Tulsa riots started. Now, the claim was it was because what was it? I think like a teenager elevator operator was attacked by another teenager, Black shoe shiner. But it served as an excuse for the white population in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to attack the very affluent Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, this was a district that where, Black Americans really strived and succeeded. They actually had a very economically successful district. And white Americans were very jealous of that. And they saw that Black Americans were becoming too powerful. So they used that as an excuse to bring down this system that was trying to be economically vibrant for themselves in the Black community. I mean, we're talking, this is the first instance where private planes were used to bomb a district.
Yeah.
The fucking bomb. Carpet bomb
those
a whole area.
ANCAPs, man. Those ANCAPs.
God. Like, this is not talked about enough in American, like, this should be, like, I only learned about this in when I took college courses of African American studies. Like, this should be taught at a high school level.
Oh, yes. Well, so it's the same thing with pedagogy of oppression, right?
Yeah.
This is considered to be the book on it, received critical appraise almost universally.
Right.
But a lot of schools in the United States don't allow people to teach it because it teaches students that they're oppressed, quote unquote.
Yeah.
It teaches about the mechanisms through it. In my mind, it's kind of like the same way that you're not seeing high school students learning about propaganda by Bernays or manufacturing consent by Chomsky. But let's continue because she still has some great.
Yeah. Okay, that's good.
Owned our property and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So
Pause
then
it again. I'm really sorry.
You finally get a little bit and you're allowed.
I just want to clarify that this is still recent history. If people haven't watched, I want people to watch Dave Chappelle's recent stand-up, because he talks about these problems in minority communities, and they're at best still 100 years young in terms of how they happened. You know, the people, you know, grandparents of the civil rights era. What was it? He was talking about, Dave Chappelle was talking about a person he knew. I'm sorry, his dad, crying to, you know, on his deathbed, crying to his grandfather, who was born a slave, great-grandfather, I'm sorry, born a slave. So this isn't as far back as people want to pretend. Like, this is still a problem. People in America think like, well, slavery's done because we ended the Civil War and race problems are over because of that, and because of the fact we had the Civil Rights era. When in reality, this is a continual process. Things just didn't stop. Like, we had Reconstruction, but it was destroyed because of Southern insurrection and the KKK. And then you had the implementation of Jim Crow, which preserved apartheid in the South. Well, I guess in the rest of America for a century.
Mm.
And you still see, again, we live in the ripple effects of history. So we're still living in the effects of that very highly segregated society of the past through ghettoization, through redlining, through those factors. I mean, this is still real. Racism is still real. People have a very simplistic version of racism where it's like, oh, well, you said the N-word, that's entirely racist, when they're ignoring systemic racism or unconscious and subliminal racism, which is probably far more prevalent than the overt racism most people realize. So I'm sorry, you can go ahead and continue. I just wanted to clarify that point.
Yeah, I think that's also a point where you had a good argument. Like, she presents it well. Like, not only are you not able to collect any money, you're actually also giving it directly to them.
Yes, and I wanted to contextualize it within what she's talking about. Like,
yeah. But the other thing that we have to think about is that is the same relation that you have when you are laboring for someone for pennies on the dollar.
Right.
It's just that instead of making
sharecropping was a prime example of that.
It is not as bad, right?
We went from slavery to sharecropping, to basically a semi-feudal idea where, like, oh, you can live here, but you got to work for me.
Yeah.
You got to till these lands, but this is technically your property.
Yeah.
But you work for me.
Pay me.
Yeah.
You need to pay me for your labor.
Yes.
And that is a consistent thing, which...
And this served as a problem for this divided working class people, because white agricultural workers would have to compete with black agricultural workers who were willing to work for cheaper because they were more desperate.
Yeah. Well,
this fueled the racism.
To put it into the words of Thomas Skidmore, now he was prior to the Republican Party, but they used a lot of his ideals within it, right? Because the Republican Party was originally pretty radical at the time.
No, it was the Liberal Party at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. So to put it this way, right? Thousands of our people of the present day are in deep distress and poverty, dependent for their daily subsistence upon a few among us, whom the unnatural operation of our own free and republican institutions, as we are pleased to call them, has arbitrarily and barbarously made enormously rich.
Yes.
Right? So we are put into a humble dependence upon these gentle capitalists, or the people with noblesse oblige, as Sir Edmund Burke would love to put it. in his critiques against Oliver Cromwell. But
you brought up Cromwell twice. I just
dude, I'm telling you, we got to make a video on Cromwell. Okay?
We'll make a video on Cromwell. We'll talk about his subjugation of Ireland for sure, because I definitely want to talk about that. But
oh yes. Okay, so let's continue it though.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's go.
And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cars. They burn your Monopoly money.
That was Tulsa.
And then finally, at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now, at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, and you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood. How can you win? Yeah. How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything.
God, that's fucking...
Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have. That if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the fuck do I give a shit about burning the fucking Football Hall of Fame, about burning a fucking Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so fuck your Target. Fuck your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
That's actually, pause that, because that is, because you see extreme examples like that with the Black Panthers and with like Louis Farrakhan right now, who's, you know, in a very vague firm arguing for Black nationalism, but like that was a fear among white people, was this armed insurrection by Black people taking over. I mean, you saw this as far back as the revolution in Haiti. You know, slave owners in the South were horrified at that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to me, I'm not one that's going to promote revenge, you know, like let's say I've had some betrayals in my life, and man, is that stuff. Yeah. When they say you might as well start taking poison for two, they're not kidding, man. That stuff really makes you. This is the shit that white nationalists fear. Like, yeah. I don't want white people to become a minority in my own country, and I'm like, I ask, like, well, why is that exactly? Are minorities treated badly in this country for some reason? Like, that should be a big brain moment for these motherfuckers. Big brain time
to fucking think about, you know, your fucking privilege.
Yeah.
And where you stand in the scheme of things.
Unfortunately, that's
I mean, you had the first gun laws were enacted because they feared about minorities owning guns and using them for uprisings.
Yeah.
I mean, the NRA basically stiffed their nose at the Black Panthers when they took over the state houses in California.
Yeah. As much as people want to criticize the idea of mercantilism or there's a fixed pie, the pie only grows so big every year.
Yeah,
you know, it only grows so big.
There's only so much to go around, and most of it goes to the upper class. So
yeah, and the
racism is fueled by what's the scraps. So
yeah, and the bigger thing is it comes down to material interest, right?
Yeah.
If you can live a better life compared to somebody else, based on, and unfortunately, right, race in our culture, in our society, has been historically based with race, right? Race and class are so tightly woven together. There are are some outliers, but it's not as much as people think. And the thing that really makes me upset is people like Candace Owens and Thomas Sowell. Right?
I want to implore people to go watch Dave Chappelle's recent stand-up because he talks about Candace Owens and how she can articulate her stupidity in the most egregious sense.
Well, it's unfortunate because similar to and they talk about this in Pedagogy of Oppression, you can also look at it with Charity Croft explaining it in about 9 minutes. It's a fantastic video. Have you seen this one?
No, I haven't. So if you want to share, go ahead. I want to watch it. So,
but basically, it's like when not to avoid white splaining things.
Yeah, I know. I just want everybody watching to yes, we understand that we're two white cis males, and we're trying to contextualize things that is to try to be the best allies for minority rights in this country. So just take that, for what it is. We're willing to listen. So, yeah.
Yeah. By no means am I any sort of expert on that. Mm-hmm. I will reference other experts in their criticism simply because. Man, I understand the place that it is to stay in my lane, but ideally it can be a little bit of education, and I want to empower people.
Empowerment enough to listen, at least.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, that's the bigger thing, right? So let me pause my video for a second if you want to talk about something.
Well. Talking about racism in America and how it's propped up, I actually wanted to talk about Confederate statues.
Yeah.
You want to talk about Confederate statues?
Let's do this first, and then we'll talk about Confederate.
Okay.
Statues.
All right.
Okay. So share screen.
Yeah.
We got it. Share. All right. Now, let's go.
What's good? My name is Charity Croft. Recently, Candace Owens said this.
I want to come out and say...
Okay, pause it. I watched this whole Candace Owens video, and I just want to say that this is nothing but character assassination of George Floyd. And again, I implore everybody to watch Dave Chappelle's stand-up about how, George Floyd did not want to become this staple person for this police brutality. He became one regardless of his past. It was not because of his past that he was killed. He was killed because he had a counterfeit $20 bill. Something my own father, a white person, was got caught for, unbeknownst to him. So let's just fucking put that out there right now. This is nothing but trying to smear somebody who was killed. It was a modern day lynching.
Well, the other thing that we need to consider too is that ideally our system promotes innocent until proven guilty, right?
Yes.
If you're using any of those things, you have basically skipped all the process. You have allowed the police officer that is apprehending that individual to turn into a judge, jury, and executioner.
Stop right there. I want to talk because Benjamin Dixon?
No.
Okay. Follow him on Twitter. Very, very intelligent man. He talks about how there's an assumption about this innocent until proven guilty for police officers in what they do. Now we're seeing with George Floyd's death, we're seeing that default position about police being innocent until proven guilty broken down, because now other people, non-minorities, are seeing the police brutality for what it is.
Or George.
Yeah. Did you see what happened on Put-in Bay?
I did. I saw that video. So everybody, okay, so
that one's a little shorter. That one's 9 minutes. We can. In the end, what I want to say is, if you really want a concise explanation at why I dislike Charity Candace and why I dislike Thomas Sowell, beyond the lack of academic rigor, is basically people can support their racist ideology with somebody that is of the community that they are criticizing, in order to say, well, I'm not racist. They're saying it on there.
Yeah. No. And again, it reigns true because I know you live in Colorado now, but we're both from Ohio, and Put-in-Bay is rather close to home for both of us. So, I mean, this is very localized in a contextual manner for us. I'm from Cleveland, so in many ways I feel the same way reverberating in many Black communities in this city. So it's not as distant or alien as many people would like to assume that it is. This is prevalent throughout the country. But anyway, the video. So
let's do you have the video for the Put-in-Bay thing?
Oh, I can look up really fast. Hang on.
Yeah, because that's much shorter than the 9-minute video there. Like it just takes a while to go through those videos. What I would say is Charity Croft does an excellent job at explaining these concepts.
I unfortunately, I don't think I can find the video actually. Put-in-Bay police. I mean, I have seen the video. I know exactly what you're talking about. And it's odd because like I know exactly where it's taking place. I'm like, oh, it's right in front of the fucking general store of Put-in-Bay. I'm like, I pass that all the time when I walk to go have a beer at the Put-in-Bay brewery, or I'd walk down the street to the Goat for lunch. So.
Yeah, way.
Oh, here we go.
You got it?
I got it.
Okay, cool. Share it.
Way too many people on this golf cart. There's only made for 4. You got your driver's license on this?
Are you?
No,
I got the audio. I don't have any video right now.
Oh, you don't have any video?
No.
Okay, let me fix that real quick.
Yeah.
Well, this one's freaking 30 minutes long, man. I don't want to see that.
I mean, we could like fast forward to the important parts, I guess, but did you get it?
I think I have it. So
you got it? Okay.
Yeah, so let's go.
All right. So this is the video Put-in-Bay.
Yep.
South Pass Island, Ohio. Of course, he's on a fucking golf cart.
Just stand over there. Oh. What rental company is that? Come here. Now you get arrested for it. What did you give her? She just stuck it down the front of her pants. Don't keep the bag. Step back.
Can you pause it for a second? Were these cops reprimanded for what happened here? I'm trying to remember if they were.
They immediately got fired. They called in a riot call for this.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I just want to contextualize this.
They called in a riot call for people sitting on a golf cart.
Yeah, exactly.
And he doesn't even know what he's arresting her for. What'd you give her? Right?
And let me just fucking put this in clarification. Put-in-Bay, South Pass Island, it's an island. You can only go so far with a stolen golf cart, even if they were stealing a golf cart. So,
I think did they steal the golf cart?
No, and even if it doesn't matter. I'm not assuming that they did. It was probably just based on an assumption. But even if they were, they can't go fucking far with it. Just saying.
Yeah.
So
back up. No, get him in cuffs.
All right, turn around.
So what I do? Get back! You want to get shot? Get back! Get back! Get back. I didn't do nothing. Put your hands behind your back. My hands is here. Put your hands behind your back. Y'all tripping, bro. Hey, no, down. No, tell me what charges. Tell me what. No, tell me what charges.
Let me pause it again. I'm sorry. There are so many people within that community, older white people, that probably think this is all justified.
Oh, I'm sure. Right now, there's FBI investigations going on into this. They fired this. They immediately profiled these people, asking if they had guns and drugs.
Yeah.
Let's just say if you didn't think there was implicit bias in police force, this is it.
Yeah, go fuck yourself if the police is impartial right now. Just honestly, at this point, literally go fuck yourself. At this point, go fuck yourself.
Yeah, you can look this up at the Toledo Blade. They have the full video that you can go for.
Right.
Do you want to get shot? Right.
Yeah.
Immediately, first threat. It's terrible. It is honestly terrible, and I hope that we get some people to realize that when you're looking at a bunch of unarmed people and you're tasing them and doing the rest of it, it's
again, going back to how the police handled the Open America protests versus what we're seeing right now, it should be astronomically fucking obvious for people to see how police impartiality is non-existent.
Oh, I'm going to let you walk into government halls with a freaking AR, and I'm going to assume that these unarmed black people are going to have drugs and guns, and I am going to threaten to shoot them.
Imagine if all these fucking protesters right now had fucking guns. Imagine.
Yeah.
Just, again.
I mean, the one thing that I will say, which is within the capitalist framework, right, is let's just say guns are expensive, right?
Right.
And you have to pass a background check, and they're protesting about a population in the legal system.
About what? So, sorry, you cut off at the. What were you talking about?
They're the people that are being marginalized, that they don't want to have firearms. A lot of them cannot.
Well, I'll pass a background check.
Pass a background check, or even a lot of felons in the United States cannot own firearms. I'm sure there are some exceptions. I don't know firearm laws across the 50 states, so
it varies because it's a state by state basis. I mean, this is why conservatives talk about, well, because Chicago is such a deadly city. Look at all the guns there. When you realize that most of the guns that are captured on crime scenes are purchased out of state, outside of Illinois.
Yeah.
So, just to put that in a contextual framework here, gun reform needs to be at a federal level, is what I'm saying. It can't be instituted at a state level.
No. And the other portion too is there are legitimate fears about our government not exactly having the best of intentions.
Well, you're looking at. I mean, I know that the threat has subsided about Trump using the military, but I talked about this in the last recording about in Trump's speech how he talked about Second Amendment rights as sort of a dog whistle to the Second Amendment people with their guns to serve as auxiliaries to help the military in putting down these protests and uprisings.
Yeah.
Like when the shit finally hits the fan, when all these NRA motherfuckers finally fear about a government crackdown, military crackdown, the thing that they fear the most, that this is why we need our guns. When the going gets tough, where are they? Silent. Just they're hiding in the bush. They're doing the Homer Simpson meme where they're hiding in the bushes.
Is that right? Like right. There's the situation, and the relative classification of the Black Panthers. I mean, you have to think about what the Black Panthers like legitimately did was, yes, they did open carry, and they
Hold on. I can't remember what I think it was True TV. It was a satirical video about, you know, NRA. And then they have a black guy come, a Black Panther, like, yes, I agree, gun rights for sure for our black people. And then all the other white people are like, well, maybe I don't know exactly for you.
yeah. And then there's a long history of that, right?
Right,
I mean,
no, yeah.
A very long history. The bigger thing is that a lot of times people don't even realize that the police, on their own admission, was founded primarily as slave catchers.
Yeah, no, you talked about this last recording. The police has a pretty brutal past in history. The fugitive slave law was a very dark sort of deal, which basically meant that northern free states had to be complicit in slavery to capture slaves that escaped the plantation, and the cops were used in that regard. Yeah. I mean, the police in general, talking about defund the police, the reason why the police get so much funding is because it's the cheapest way for basically everyone to sweep society's problems under the rug. I mean, we can talk about reforms, social work, and whatnot, but it's apparently it's so much cheaper for politicians to just fund the police to just aggressively sweep all these problems under something to forget about. And these protests and riots, I think, are like the chickens coming home to roost from that. That's just me.
Yeah.
There's a far underlying factor here with all this. Going back to that lady's video, I mean, there's a far underlying factor with all of this happening.
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about looting, which is fine, but she brings up a point that, I mean, this is what I was talking about. When how the police break up these protests, the police are primarily focused on breaking up these protests and arresting the protesters. They're not giving a fuck about the looting. They're not giving a fuck about the destruction of property. Their priorities are concerned elsewhere because the police can only do so much. So
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that they don't care about looting, because one of the big things that police are there for is the defense of property.
Well,
right?
Which property? Mind you, I agree, because I don't have the video. I don't have the video, but if you watch Majority Report's last video on Friday, they talk about a black business where the police were there and they just let the motherfucking burn. Oh yeah. No, they I mean, there's definite again bias and prejudice that's being enacted. There's also a great video series with Killer Mike that goes on where he tries to keep money in the black community for 24 hours, and that's in Atlanta. Yeah.
And that's in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And the average amount of time that a single dollar bill stays within a black-owned business or in the black community is 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yeah.
2 hours.
Well, you can't get too big because then you're going to end up with another Tulsa.
Yeah. And that legacy has extended through redlining and other components. I do want to talk about looting next time.
That's fine.
And I mean, we touched on some of the things like with genocide, but we should extrapolate on how colonialism is basically legalized extortion of resources and global looting, along with wage labor, right?
Yeah. I mean, do you still have time to talk about propaganda colonialism with Confederate statues?
Can we talk about that next week?
That's fine. We can talk about it next week. It's fine.
Yeah, I gotta go take care of the kiddo.
All right, no problem. Well, this was fun as always.
All right, good seeing you, bro.
Good seeing you. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good day. Peace.